Welcome back. We're jumping into section 2 of the book, getting into some of the really meaty stuff and really helping us frame our analysis and our discussions together. This chapter,
So media content. I love this chapter because it gives us some language to use moving forward and some analytical frames and tools at our disposal.
chapter 6, is about media as manipulation. And this is a great chapter because it really brings up a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in class in our discussion boards, especially around chapter 5. We've had some good conversation there already around the agency of media users and how much agency we have in choosing the content we consume. So let's go ahead and dive in. So let's jump into these Marxist approaches to views of society. Unsurprising here, not sure how many of you have studied Marx before, but he and many others of his school argue that there's a prevailing socioeconomic order and it's exploitative. And media is an integral part of this system, and it reflects and bolsters the agendas of the established powerful media interests. Now, looking at this chart, when you're reflecting on this chapter, do any of you disagree with what you see? Because when we look on the left, we, in terms of passing down wealth, our tax system still enables this. It's still very prevalent in our educational system and the distribution of resources. And then how the media propagates this sort of idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And this is interesting because we have some of the lowest rates of social economic mobility. So your ability to get from the lowest quintile to the next quintile, and so on and so forth, is nearly impossible in our society, despite what we regularly hear as this sort of cultural narrative that the American dream is possible. You just have to work really hard. And that's always a really interesting argument too, because it implies that people who are working 2 or 3 jobs just are not working hard enough, and that's why they're experiencing poverty. When we well know it has so much more to do with not just the narratives that we create, but the policies that we continue to sustain. And we also have some of the lowest rates of mobility in the wealthy, rich world. As Martin Luther King said, how do you pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have boots? And so I'd love your thoughts here. Do the media still keep out ideas that are harmful to elites? And I know we've been talking about this in some of our conversations about how we see media not challenge some of the elites because they are funding some of the media. So this makes it really challenging to look at things from a critical lens if you're in sort of big media business. Questions to think about: did the police still victimize the working class, ignoring elite crime? And especially looking at the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we haven't held people who were responsible, bank managers, operators, owners, accountable for all the financial crime that went down. Other countries did. Iceland, for example, sent those folks to jail, but we didn't. And so if you look at this chart, take a look and reflect on if you disagree with it, and if so, why. And could you clarify or add some substance to some of the trends that maybe contradict this or challenge it? And that's something we can talk about in our discussion. It's not a prompt, but you're welcome to reflect on it and think about it as we move forward. And now we have Adorno and Horkheimer. They argue the idea that cultural industry is one of assimilation and production, and it allows for predictability of products and makes consumption simple, repetitive, and effortless. And if you think about some of the consumption in our lives, whether it's iPhones or technology or even Amazon, who, their whole business model is to make it easier and easier and simpler and effortless to shop and to shop more. So does it support this thinking? When you're thinking about some of the consumption in our lives, does it support this thinking that consumption for us has been made simple, that it's repetitive, that it's effortless, and thus we're constantly refining and reaffirming this culture industry. And I just pulled this old image because it was the best representation of this kind of cultural industry production and how it actually undermines some human expression, creativity, because we're just churning out this kind of effortless, repetitive, simple products to consume. This is interesting too if you kind of think about this from a social media perspective, and so it might not even just be products that we're consuming, but it's people that we're consuming, and this idea of this influencer culture. So it's something to think about here. Really curious if this resonates with you, if you disagree with it. Again, feel free to put that in our discussion if you are inclined. Pseudo-individualization is talked about in this chapter too, and that this is the idea that we're somehow have been empowered to make unique decisions, and that makes us different than the masses or the population as a whole. This is a great example, this sort of Coke or Pepsi example, because in fact there's very little difference. I'm sure Coke or Pepsi people might disagree with me, but even though there's very little difference, people seek their identity with Coke or Pepsi. So they're creating identity around a product. And that this idea that I'm somehow unique, individualized, when in fact, the critique here is that no, it's pseudo, it's false individualism, it's false individualization. And our political parties are very similar in many ways. Republicans and Democrats and our parameters about what it means to be politically engaged are quite narrow. But we identify with one of those parties as a way of individualizing, when in fact the critics would say, no, that's just not actually a full self-realization or self-actualization, because if you were fully self-actualized and self-individualized, it would take you outside of the party structure of the two-party system. Outside the Coke, outside the Pepsi options that you currently have available to you and are presented in this way. So next is this idea put forth by the Frankfurt School, and their argument is that media and culture have been incorporated into the all-encompassing socioeconomic system dominated by instrumentalism, rationality, and objectification. Their contention is that the culture industry really ends or undermines any prospect of mass opposition. And I'm really curious your thoughts here if you want to add them to our discussion board. And even thinking about mass opposition in the United States over the last 100 years. So I remember going to my first Women's March after Trump was elected in 2016, and they were really commodified, the pink pussy hats and this sort of performative aspect, and led there was a lot of debate around these marches because they were led pretty much exclusively by white women. And so there really wasn't this sort of faction of any group that's been marginalized and will really experience some of the severe impacts of the Trump presidency. So they were, in a sense, just an afternoon activity. Why don't we go down protest from 1 to 4, take some photos for the gram, and then we go home and we continue living our lives in the ways that we've continued to live them. And you don't see some of the kind of mass opposition that we saw in the 60s or 70s during the civil rights era, and some of the mass opposition that preceded that. And I will say though that some of the really earnest and powerful movements and protests around racial justice that really do center people with lived experience and youth, especially around racial justice and gun violence, have been really more akin to the sort of mass opposition we might have seen in previous eras. That's just one take on it. I'd be curious if you have other thoughts. And I'd be curious if you agree with the Frankfurt School's thinking here, that because of this economic system, we're somehow undermining our willingness to let go of that in favor of real opposition and real revolution, real overthrow, and real change. And again, you can challenge this notion thinking about some of the recent mass opposition movements we've seen and how people have challenged some of these big media actors and big players, and there's just been a lot of strife, as we've just seen in the national sphere. So I'm curious what this tipping point 2 might look like from taking us from this comfortable role as consumers and willingness to let that go and engage in mass opposition and this dominant economic system. And here we have some more extrapolation on Marx and his theories. Just looking at the chart on the right, his thinking was that the base controlled the superstructure so that the base was dominant. Now people have critiqued this and challenged this notion that the economic predominance doesn't in fact control the superstructure, which is something, superstructure is something you see in social sciences, but that the economic system controlling that, shaping it, maintaining it, this is where we add in Gramsci with some of these challenges to this structure. Now, Gramsci, he ultimately thought that hegemony of the economic system could be challenged, and that's the importance of civil society. And so on the right, you see here up at the top, rather than ruling by force, which in some countries and societies around the world, they still do that with military state, police state, and they use that to control the masses. In more democratic societies, you rule through consent, and that's the importance of civil society. But how you rule the masses is through media, through culture, through education, and that's how you indoctrinate and inculcate. So curious your thoughts here, if this resonates with you, if you agree or disagree with it, and feel free to do some reflection and thinking on this and add it to our chat discussion. Getting into a few other things Chapter 6 raises, we'll get into Naomi Klein's critique around commodity fetishism. I hope I don't have to say that again. And I'm curious for you all if you think that we're more in touch with the end product or the consequence of our consumption than we used to be in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And because currently our economic system is predicated on free trade and capitalism, of course, and as a society, we see that as positive and generally support that narrative in terms of our narrative discourse in the United States, that free trade's good, supports capitalism, supports our society, etc. Issue here being that when for capitalism to exist, free trade to exist, there have to be economic losers, right? People who are abused by the system for us to have cheap goods, to have cheaper things, any of those things that you can think of. And fair trade is really still marginal as a concept, but free trade is a positive problem to people in the United States because we've really outsourced much of that trade and sweatshops. And sporadically we'll see the media pay attention to this and the working conditions in China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, elsewhere. But it kind of has pittered off where people don't really talk about sweatshops like they used to. It was really big, as you might remember, in the 90s. And Nike was talking about it, everybody was talking about it. But this is still happening, but we are not hearing those stories in the news. And of course, there's still people who aren't paid a living wage, who don't have enough food to feed their families. And so what would it take for us to challenge this economic system so we're not merely consumers of a problematic system that's disenfranchising whole populations and under-resourcing them and keeping them from a living wage? So how do we challenge that? And how do we tie ourselves as consumers to the larger economic system. So continuing on in this topic, what would it really take us to fix this issue, to arrest this issue, to stop it? We've really outsourced it, so we're not in touch with it, but it's not a closed system, it's not closed loops, and we're not seeing it. And so what would it take for us to challenge this so that people are aware enough and care enough to make a switch? Of course, this issue ties into the climate crisis. And what's interesting to me is we see a lot of particularly young people on social media doing these Shein hauls, which is basically just bags and bags of fast fashion, and advertising that on their platforms and trying to sell these clothes to more people. And then there's this idea in our culture that you can simply donate clothes that you don't want, and you're kind of wiped of that guilt of consumption. Speaking as someone who worked in waste prevention for the city of Eugene for about 4 years, we would regularly do tours of secondhand stores. And the part of this system that's not discussed nearly enough is what happens to the clothes they don't sell. And what we learned is that they're either thrown away or shipped off to other countries for them to deal with. And there really is no way. It just becomes someone else's problem, and likely the same populations we've abused in our clothes manufacturing systems. And this was a huge issue in all the programs I worked in waste. There was very little interest in doing anything that would prevent waste. That was not what people wanted to do. They really wanted to focus on this end part, so the composting, the donating clothes, when in reality we have to be thinking upstream if we want to change systems like that. And again, it becomes really hard to communicate about these things as a communicator because people are not willing to shift their behaviors. And so what would it take to include this in our national discourse, that we benefit from cheap labor elsewhere, and really how do we challenge how we've been ruled by this to not care or think about this? Noam Chomsky talks a lot about corporate control of communications and how it prevents a critique of the capitalist order. So what do you think about this? Do you think that we're manufacturing consent in America? Or do you think that we're more independent than that and not subject to this kind of mental control? So let's briefly get into cultural imperialism. In previous centuries, our imperialist control and how we colonized countries was through force, versus what we've been talking about in this chapter, this ruling through force versus ruling through consent. And, we colonized, Dutch colonized, Spanish colonized, Brits colonized, and now there's this idea of cultural imperialism. We're colonizing again through consent. So this is where culture and media come into play. And do you see any sort of concerning aspects of this? Is this problematic, this idea that we're colonizing through consent, from a cultural imperialist perspective, or is it not, and is it just free trade? And this is, an important growth in the globalized world, but curious if you have any critiques of this in terms of the cultural indoctrination that comes with this, and of course, that comes with mass media. So I apologize, this lecture was much longer than I anticipated, but there was so much richness in this chapter that I wanted to capture and be able to put forth discussion questions to you all. This is, next chapter is quite a bit shorter, so we won't be going into as much of a video lecture, so hopefully you were able to stick around for this one. So I asked a lot of questions throughout to prompt your thinking, but here's the reflection questions and discussion questions I really want to get into this week. So one, I've been loving this people selecting examples of media. I think that has been the most fun thing to watch people dissect it and learn more about it. So we'll do that again this week. So select an example of a media text. Again, text is anything, any of the following. It could be a website, a TV program, image, film, music. And now I want you to subject its structure and content to ideology critique. In what ways might it reinforce dominant understandings of the world? And 2, are Marxist approaches to media rendered entirely redundant by 1, assertions that audiences are active, or 2, the diverse and interactive form taken by contemporary digital media environments. So this kind of ties back into John Fiske with audience as agents of power, and so it all kind of loops back into each other. And so I really look forward to seeing your discussions this next week, and please reach out if you have any questions. I will see you in Chapter 7.